Hello, and welcome to another episode of A Junior, a Senior, and I, in which the title keeps being a lie. Because today I'm joined by Liz and Rachel to talk about observability. By me mangling that term from the beginning, you can see that I'm not really knowledgeable about it, but I'm sure they are. Before we start, let's meet our guests. Liz, could you introduce yourself in 3 sentences or less, please?
Yeah, so by career, I'm a site reliability engineer, and I've been working at Honeycomb since I left Google about 7 years ago, and I'm a technical fellow.
Cool, thanks. What about you, Rachel?
I also used to work at Google, actually overlapped with Liz at Google Cambridge from about 2009 or 10 for maybe a few years. My career took me into software engineering and then software engineering management, often in the field of user activity logging. So when I heard about observability, it sounded interesting.
Cool. Yeah, I think that gets us into my first question because I'm not knowledgeable about this subject at all, and that's why I'm happy to learn from you. What is observability? Like, I have logs at my company and we sort of look at them sometimes when there is a huge issue, but is that observability or is it something else?
I would say observability is like testability or accessibility, right? Like it's a property of your systems. So the logs are not the observability, right? Like the logs might be how you achieve observability to varying degrees. So in my view, observability is the degree to which we can understand and manage our systems based off of the telemetry data that those systems emit.
So something that I read in, I think, Charity's writing is that observability could be considered the power to ask new questions of your system without having to ship new code or gather new data in order to answer those questions.
And Rachel here is talking about Charity Majors, who is my boss.
Indeed. And so observability can be about unknown unknowns in that you have perhaps logged data enough to answer not just today's questions, but maybe tomorrow's questions. Is that about correct?
Yeah, I would say that's what more advanced observability looks like, right? So people who are getting started with observability might not be able to achieve that degree of being able to answer unknown unknowns, but that certainly is our aspiration, is not to just answer, hey, what are, the number of HTTP 200s, right? Like we know in advance we are going to ask that question, but instead, what happened with these users in Quebec who are using the CA French language pack, right? That's kind of more of a abstract question that you might not have thought in advance you'd be asking of your data.
From how you both are referring to this, I feel like there are kind of levels of observability in the sense that you will have people that have only, we are getting 90% of our requests are 200, or this is the mean time to response, and then people that get some data of this button has been clicked X times, and then people that actually will start segmenting different data and getting answers that they don't know they were questioning yet, right?
So here's maybe an example that brings in a little bit of my career, and I'm just curious what the current kind of Honeycomb or observability take on it would be. I worked on user activity logs for Google Search for an insane amount of time, and these were filtered down to individual events that involved real users, but actually included a lot of server-related data too, tended to blend a little telemetry with a lot of user data. And they were something that I read about with observability, which is they were arbitrarily wide structured log events that were treated as a single source of truth after filtering to get rid of bots and spam. And many fields did have tremendous cardinality, which for listeners means that a single field might be filled with a wide variety of possible values. And that made anonymization a problem sometimes, similar to something that Liz said. If, for example, Google only has, say, 7 queries from some specific tiny country about a specific topic in a certain language, you don't actually want to act on that and change your ranking algorithms based on those 7. That ends up being uncool. And so I see a certain amount of tension between the cardinality and the granularity and privacy, anonymity, et cetera. But what do you think, Liz? Is Google search observable?
I would say that the way that people use that data, at least during my tenure at Google between 2008 and 2019, was that we did not use the GWS logs, the Google Web Server logs, for anything operational, right? Like we didn't use it for monitoring, for observability, right? Like it was strictly a user behavior data sync, right? Like rather than operational. And that was for 2 reasons, right? Like number one, you would have to have a very good reason to interact with that user data, and most of the people who were doing operational tasks didn't have that permission. And secondly, that it was not really designed to be plotted on dashboards and stuff, right? Like, the backend query engine, right? Like you could use something called Dremel, right? Like that was very, very powerful for writing quick SQL-like queries that would execute very quickly, right? So to me, that was a form of observability, right? Like, and it would have been really cool to leverage it for observability, but we primarily used other data sources that had less personal data in order to do that. So I think when I look at the design of a product like Honeycomb or the design of a product like ClickHouse, you see some remarkable similarities between the kind of Sawmill, Dremel data stores and a columnar storage database like Honeycomb or ClickHouse, right? It's this kind of idea of what if you took these wide events and instead of pre-aggregating the data, you post-aggregated it at read time, right? Like, so I think that to me is a similarity. It's the similarity of how do you actually analyze the data, but the purposes, I think, were very disjoint. Rachel, I do see you shaking your head in a little bit of disagreement.
There were certainly many dashboards that were made from GWS logs. Whether they were designed to be dashboarded, I couldn't really say. I am curious whether you are purposely limiting your discussion of observability more to the telemetry or system monitoring type stuff, because I can easily take the words I'm reading and apply them to questions about users. But you seem to be a little bit making a distinction.
I think that in the end, everything resolves into a data lake, right? Like everything resolves into being able to answer questions using the data that you have. I come from things from an SRE perspective. And also, I think that business analysts, right, that people who are, as you were saying, right, like working on search ranking and optimization, right, like those are also use cases for this data lake where they do need to understand what's going on with their users. So I think it depends on what your definition of the system is and how the system is behaving, right? When I talked about observability as a property, right? So for me, coming from a reliability lens, the thing I care about in terms of system performance is trying to understand, like, why is it slow? Is it working for the users, right? But if you're a search analyst, right, the observability is into the ranking system, right? Like it's not about availability, it's about quality of results, right? Like, and I think that also is a form of observability. It's just a different one than the one that I'm used to as a site reliability engineer.
Yep, that makes sense to me. We definitely both agree from our perspectives that you cannot tack on logging after the fact. It needs to be there to begin with.
And it needs to not be pre-aggregated down, right? Like imagine if all of the GWS logs were just pre-aggregated and you just, stripped away so that you could query only by browser or only by language, but not by language and browser at the same time. That would be disastrous.
And the truth is Google does have data sets like that are specifically for certain dashboards. But the underlying data remains there to be queried. And when to use each one is way beyond the scope of this.
Yes, but I think that, right, like, Pablo, does that make sense as far as what we're getting at, kind of the levels of observability, right? Like, you can get basic observability by squashing everything down, number of 500s, number of 200s, right? Number of Chrome users, number of Firefox users. But, like, if you need to ask combinations of that or filter the data more granularly, right, like, and you can't, that's a sign that you're missing that up level in your observability.
What's confusing to me is that and again, my experience is quite limited, but I've never seen the pre-aggregation you're talking about, right? And probably it's because my volumes are not that big, and so it's never been that much of a problem. I didn't need to compress the data in any sort of way. And so my aggregation has always been done after I've gathered the logs, and then we do stuff with that, right? Or we used PostHog at our company, and we use user data there to do some user research, but we send everything and then we do the aggregation after. I've never encountered in my, again, limited career, a case where I have to pre-aggregate the data and actually make decisions on how that data is going to be searched after before I know how it's going to be searched after, right?
But you do that every time you set up a metric. You are already doing that every time you set up a metric, right? When you're using logging, you can absolutely log everything up to a certain scale, right? Like, but at larger scales, certainly the scales that Rachel and I worked at Google, right? Like that stops becoming necessarily practical to do searches against 100% of the data, right? Like that's why we start thinking about techniques like sampling. Like maybe you just need a representative sample of 1 in 1,000 queries, and that's good enough for your purposes, right? Like it's maybe not good enough for billing, advertisers on their ads, but it's good enough for getting an understanding of, if I just care to the nearest half a million queries, right? Like, I don't need to examine every single query.
So here's a possible time when maybe you would want some pre-aggregation or at least pre-processing. I can't tell whether observability is placing itself against all pre-processing. But speaking of metrics, for Google search specifically, because it's an easy example that everybody's heard of, there is a tremendous amount of effort that goes into figuring out whether some particular query is not actually a real human user doing a normal human user search, but is instead a spam click, a bot, something automated, something that we don't actually want to base our user activity metrics on. And if different metrics use different forms of filtering, you can get into trouble. And if different metrics decide to categorize, this traffic definitely came from Safari differently, you can get into trouble. So there's a lot of trying to standardize certain things across metrics that leads some data sets into doing some of this pre-sorting and pre-filtering for the sake of maintaining compatibility so things can be compared.
Yeah, the kind of danger is schema drift. The danger is inconsistent pre-computation, right? Like those are things that Rachel especially has had to kind of deal with at larger scales with many, many different teams, writing data in various schemas, right? Like, and we see this in the reliability, observability perspective as well, right? Like this is why we haven't brought up OpenTelemetry yet, but we should. So OpenTelemetry is one of the CNCF graduated projects now, and it's a standard for how you process and emit telemetry data. And it does have things for standardizing, it's, request.user agent and not request.user space agent or request.browser, right? It's stuff like that to make sure that your schemas are consistent and they're being emitted in the same format and you can cross-correlate all of this data together, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then, aren't you running into the problem that most standards have, which is they are standard, in the sense that aren't they limiting what you can search after or what you can actually log because they are a standard?
No, you can add custom schemas, right? Like it's a arbitrary bag of key value pairs. The semantic conventions are one part of OpenTelemetry, but they're not an exclusive thing, right? So there are standard semantic conventions for HTTP servers, for gRPC servers, but every organization is going to have, in addition, its own overlay of semantic conventions for this is how we encode user ID, this is how we encode, language, this is how we encode build ID, right? Like, so it's meant to be kind of composable. The key thing about OpenTelemetry is that when you change where you're sending the data or potentially even tee the data to multiple different sinks, right? You don't have to rip up your SDK that you're using to send that data, right? Like you can customize it and say, I want to send this to 2 different places at once, right? Like to A/B test things, or I want to migrate in place, or I want to run transforms on this data.
That's interesting. I'm going to switch a bit topics because I feel like there is a volume thing here in 2 regards. First is how do you manage the volume? And the second is there a minimum volume of requests or of data you need to actually be observable?
You were getting at it right at the beginning, Pablo, right? Like you were saying, you've never had a sufficiently large volume that you've had to sample or pre-aggregate, right? Like, and I think that's, you almost have kind of the spherical perfect observability there if you are able to keep everything in full resolution, right? And that stops working at scale and you have to start approximating, right? Like, but I would say, the more precise you can be relative to your needs, the better. And I think a lot of that challenge is as organizations scale, as their data volume scales, they start making sacrifices that hinder their observability, right? So when we're talking about scale, we're saying that there are challenges in maintaining that level of observability as you scale, rather than saying you have to be big to be observable. That's not at all true. In fact, the larger you get, the harder it gets to be observable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I have a related set of comments, which is that even if you're not saving a ton of data every day, depending on how long you retain the data, you will also eventually run into scale and storage problems. Because it turns out that despite what Google tried to do for a while, you can't actually keep everything forever in its full form. Nor should you. So you will always be throwing data away one way or another. So the question isn't really whether you're going to throw data away, it's how you do it and when. And at production scale, there can be a third option of anonymization and fuzzing to kind of throw some of it away. I know that some of the observability stuff that I read about talked about intelligent tail-based sampling rather than keeping samples from the head or really aggressive aggregation. The idea that I read about anyway was to keep 100% of the interesting events. Hopefully there's not too many. And sample down on the boring ones so that you can preserve debugging utility while kind of controlling volume. And I did think that was really, really smart.
Yep. We call that dynamic sampling. So it's the idea that, you have a relatively small number of HTTP 500s, you have a relatively small number of requests. Well, by definition, anything that is over your P99 latency is going to be 1% of your traffic, right? So if you keep the slowest 1% of your requests, you keep your HTTP 500s, right? Like it's a compression problem. I encourage people to think about it as a compression problem. Almost all of your 200s look roughly alike to each other, at least similar enough to other 200s, right? Like you don't have to keep all of your HTTP 200s that are fast, right? Similar to, we're recording this on a streaming video connection, right? Like, and I know for a fact that, every single one of these light purple pixels behind me, we're not streaming every single one of those light purple pixels to you all on the call, right? Like those are all being compressed into, there's, a whole bunch of these purple pixels. And like, I just have an approximation for how many of them there are, and we don't have to send each one in full fidelity, right? So that's how I encourage people to think about dynamic sampling is it's a form of compression for your data, right? Like you want to keep the interesting data that in the case of a video frame, it's the data at the edges and of a color distinction. And in the form of observability data, it's your errors, it's your slow requests, and it's your rare requests, even if they're successful, which I think we were talking about earlier, Rachel. How do you balance the fact that the most interesting data is also the most identifiable?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I'm discovering another world because for me, the naive approach to this compression problem is, quote unquote, I run out of memory, first in, first out.
You run out of memory, or the other failure mode, to be honest, is that it is slow, even if you technically can store all of it, right? Like, if you've got 30 gigabytes of logs and you are searching it on your own PC, it will take a while to grind through 30 gigabytes of logs, right? And then you have a choice of, do you approximate? Do you scan, 1 in 1,000 rows in that 30 gigabytes of logs? Or do you brute force it, right? Like, do you use a MapReduce to farm through it, right? Like, those are kind of your trade-offs, right? Like, you can sample or you can brute force. But as your data volume increases, right, like, usability is not just about technical capability to store the data. It's also about, can you ergonomically query it without, being like, okay, it's time to make a fresh cup of coffee. I'll come back in half an hour, right?
Yep. Speed is a feature.
Speed is 100% a feature. And I used to take a more dismissive approach, I think, towards search analysts and say, you know what, it's fine if their Sawmill search takes 20 minutes to run. I no longer think that, right? Like, I think everyone deserves to have queries against any volume of data really, like, return at least approximate results within 10 seconds, right? If you really want to wait for the full results, sure, wait the half an hour, but like, speed really helps everyone, not just SREs.
I feel like we're focusing a lot on the logging, which is like, I'm guessing the basic unit of observability. You can add events and stuff like that, but like, it feels like most of the data will be logging, right?
It's logging of a form, right? Like, I think everything revolves around wide events, right? Like bags of key value pairs. And if you have really primitive logging, there's one key and it's called log message. And the body is, this 1 kilobyte string or something. But like, ideally you start breaking up your data, HTTP status code, user agent, stuff like that. And then also the nlock is to tie requests together, right? Like to say, this request has a canonical request ID that we trace all the way through our system so we can find all the logs associated with that request ID. And then from there, the next level is saying, you know what, actually, I don't just want the ordered representation of what happened as we process the request, but I also want to see the causal chain. I want to see what caused what, right? Like, and that's how you get trace ID and span ID as fields, right? So that's why we're talking about traces and logs interchangeably here, is that a trace is just a log with a trace ID and span ID and parent ID on it. And then a metric is an aggregation of that data. Whether you think of it as an aggregation data or not, in practice, you are generating your, count of HTTP 500s. That is coming from aggregating an underlying event under the hood.
No, yeah, of course. But it feels like the more naive approach to logging is, as you said, you have trace ID, log message, and then you have whatever is written there, right? Like the 1 kilobyte of text. It feels like that's the most ineffective way to be able to search through that. Like, grabbing text.
Yes, because then you have to search the entire string, right? Like, and it's the data you're fishing for might be at the start of the string, it might be in the end string, it might be in the middle, right? Like, yeah, it's a mess, and that's why people start pulling out data that they want to index or use.
Yeah, don't log strings. Strings are just evil in logs.
Yeah, but again, for someone that is not as sophisticated in this space as you are, like me, the naive approach is I log a string because everything pushes me to log a string, right? My default, I use Rails, and Rails outputs strings, and that gets recorded into a file of text afterwards. And then I feel like you have to have a problem with that before you go to, now I'm going to do it structured with key value pairs, and actually it deserves a lot of reflection that a lot of people starting out will not have.
And that's okay. You can retrofit it after the fact, right? Like, this is where things like the Open Telemetry Collector, right? Like I was mentioning, having a standard way to pass telemetry data around and to do transforms on it. You can, at the time that you're reading the data off the wire before it gets sent to your backend, you can hoist fields out of that arbitrary string, right? As long as you know what the format of the string is, you can just parse it. And then you can store each individual field and its values separately to reduce the scan volume, right? So I think that's an optimization that many people are doing, whether they're doing it with Cribble or MindPlane or Datadog Vector, right? Like, there's so many products out there that help people make that transition from unstructured to structured logs these days.
Yep, and it'll happen. There'll be pain that causes you to do it. I know that I went off on this topic more extensively in the metrics episode that we did with Terry, but pretty much all metrics are some kind of proxy for human happiness. And this is sort of another case where pain will force people away from the unstructured strings as soon as their queries get slow, and then it will get fixed.
Right, like it's absolutely if you give people the tools to solve their problems, it is a self-solving problem because people will be incentivized to do the right thing. If people don't have those tools, then they're just going to think, every single time I run a query, it's learned helplessness. It's just going to take 30 seconds, or it's going to take 2 minutes. I should go and get a fresh cup of coffee.
Why are you so against coffee?
I'm not against coffee. I'm against disrupting your workflow and your state of flow when you are working on something and something forces you to stop. And now I'm going to mention the word AI for the first time in this conversation. The problem is even worse when it comes to agents, because if an agent can take 5 seconds, 10 seconds to write a query, if that query then takes 2 minutes to come back, right, like, you're wasting so much time, right? A human might take 30 seconds or a minute to write a query, so that balancing that against 2 minutes, that's okay-ish. It's not great. But yeah, if you want quicker feedback loops, right? Like, that's why you might be investing in using language models. And now suddenly you've just stuck this giant wait sleep loop in there, right? Like, it's painful. It's an impedance mismatch.
That speed as a feature really does resonate, and from a different field, and that those feedback loops is really something you need. Like, it's something I'm used to, and it's true that when I try to look at my logs, it's always a pain because I'm always waiting, right? Like, either I do a search or whatever, and it's like, okay, and now I have to wait, and you do forget half of the things you were thinking, what I was actually looking for, stuff like that. And that's at my level. How do people get around that at actual volumes, let's say?
Oh, you just brute force it with more and more compute, right? Like, that's how Dremel works at Google. That's how Sawmill works at Google, is basically, if you have the ability to dispatch a MapReduce with 50,000 workers, 100,000 workers, like, you do that because your people's time is more important than the compute cycles.
Or if you have some idea what kind of queries you're going to be making, you can do the pre-aggregation thing. You can create a data set that is pre-sliced on, say, for example, browser and country. And then you can have much faster queries that are just filtered on browser and country. But anything else, you'll have to fall back to the large, slow data set.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like, it's this question of, you don't want to sacrifice your ability to do the n-aggregated queries, but you can do an optimization layer on top of that. Yeah, I think the other approach that many organizations do, right, like, if for no other reason than collection efficiency, is you can just say, I'm going to sample 1 in 1,000 requests. Or Google, for tracing, it was 1 in every 100,000 requests was traced through Dapper, the tracing system, right? Because otherwise the CPU overhead would overwhelm everything, right? So at certain scales, yes, you do make those sacrifices, and you don't just do the tail sampling of keeping your 200, your 500s, but you're actually saying, I'm going to head sample and just off the top take, only 1 in 1,000 requests.
So something that we haven't talked about yet very much is access, in terms of who within a company gets access to all of this data that we're talking about writing down. Something that I learned at Google past a certain scale, past a certain time in history, is that access always involves some level of insider risk, or maybe an external person posing as an insider, but at some point it can be dangerous to let too many people access this data. The two main things that I learned to worry about kind of fell into two main categories. One of them is mass exfiltration, which is the idea that someone might basically grab a huge amount of a whole data set and spill it onto the web somewhere. This is the same kind of thing that has very famously happened to places like Ashley Madison, right? Where an entire data set just gets dumped out somewhere. And the second main risk was re-identification of a user, where maybe somebody with logs access wants to snoop on their ex-girlfriend or something. And so they go trying to figure out which log records are hers and somehow using that in a bad way. What I've read about observability, and I have not read the whole book, I didn't see a lot about kind of access control policies or tiered access or sort of who should and shouldn't be able to query observability data. So I'm curious what the Honeycomb take is on that.
Well, I think in general, we want to democratize access to systems data, not necessarily user data. But I think that when you enable as many people as possible to be curious about their data and to look into performance anomalies and so forth, right? I think that is generally a good thing. So I think it's about balancing the need to know with the exposure risk, right? How valuable is this data to operationally, and also what's the potential for misuse? So in terms of Honeycomb, we've certainly had some clients who have asked us about, hey, can you do RBAC, role-based access control? And we've said, yes, we will support role-based access control at the, environment level, even at the, individual data set or service level. But we're really, really skeptical about this idea of, sure, send your PII and SPII data like social security numbers or driver's license numbers or stuff like that, right? Sure, send that through into Honeycomb, right? We don't want to have that data, even if we had individual column level access.
For the audience, what does PII stand for and what's SPII?
So PII is personally identifiable information and SPII is sensitive personally identifiable information. Definitely things that you, in my opinion, probably don't want your observability provider to be hanging on to. But I do think that that's at odds with, having this data lake and the single source of truth. If some truths can't be in that data set, because then it would potentially cause, risk to the person who's storing and maintaining the data.
Right. So my data lake that I once upon a time had access to was definitely a wild mix of everything from SPII down to stuff that was completely not sensitive to telemetry data, stuff like this. And one thing we did was have access levels that were basically encoded into each field. So it was a little bit column by column. And people could then get access at whatever access tier, and I have forgotten their names, but that would enable people to access some fields, but not others.
And even there was this cool feature called break class, where you could have normal access to one level, and then you would have to input a authorization reason for accessing above your tier and to have that audit logged somewhere. And honestly, I think for Honeycomb, a lot of our defense there is every query that you perform is logged and recorded, right? You can go back and audit what people queried.
Google has that too, via a couple of systems called Gen and Tonic, but they're still also break glass. How often are those logs of logs accesses accessed?
Honestly, I think that this is a great role for autonomous systems to play, right? You can do machine learning to identify which accesses to flag as suspicious, right? And to actually escalate and have a human look at. You can do, auditing and say, I'm just going to examine 1 in 1,000 access requests, right? We were talking earlier about, maybe some people don't mind being caught, but in general, the risk of being caught tends to deter bad behavior.
I want to go back to the PII subject in the sense that I feel like you can identify someone from fields or from data that would not be considered PII. Because I'm guessing a lot of companies or a lot of platforms log, for example, your location. But I'm probably one of the few people that go from the area around my home to the area around my office every day. So if someone got a hold of that and got a hold of my user ID, they could know what I'm doing, even though they don't have my name or my email or whatever, right?
Yes, and it doesn't even have to be unauthorized. It can actually be fully authorized by a U.S. court, right? Like that's what geofence warrants are, right? Like find all the people who are in this area and in that area within a 24-hour period, right? Like the companies regularly get requests for that. And either you have to, de-anonymize your users, or you have to decide that you're not keeping that data.
Yeah, correct. I was actually going to get around to law enforcement because one of the last teams that I ran at Google, and I think in the end I ran 9 teams or so, the very final one was to support court cases. And there were definitely times when it was advantageous to simply not have the data, for sure. And we did not work specifically with the other branch called LIS, which does law enforcement support for things like FBI warrants and these geofence requests and stuff. But once or twice we did help them, very off the record. And those were some unnerving analyses to run.
I think it boils down to, in general, people want to do the right thing, right? Like, yes, there are some creeps out there, but in general, right, like, you get very, very unnerved because, like, this is very, very sensitive information. People have entrusted your company with storing this information, and you are a guardian of it.
Right. And companies often make these promises to users that behind the scenes have carve-outs for things like law enforcement and warranties, and that the public is not necessarily aware of that. So the most privacy-forward thing you can possibly do is to not store the data at all, or to store it for a very, very short amount of time. And that clearly comes into tension with this idea of ask whatever you want anytime over data of any age.
In general, though, the fine-grained access data is most useful in the first half hour, 2 hours, right? Like when you're actively working on an incident. Past that, it tends to age. And right, like, we were talking about, access controls, what's the benefit of you needing to know this, right? Like, how risky is this, right? Like the value of unredacted logs like basically plummets after the first couple of hours, and at that point it becomes more of a liability than a benefit to keep them.
Right. So are you actually in favor of very temporary log records?
I think I am in favor of masking them, right? Like masking them or aggregating them down or redacting them after a certain level of time. Yeah.
We used to do partial anonymization. We used to do fuzzing of the IP address, fuzzing of the geolocation for sure.
Yeah, there's this whole field that's actually called anonymization engineering or something. Damien Desfontaines is a expert in that field, right? Like, and they basically have this idea of if you just add random noise, you actually haven't done anything, because then you can take the random points and you can all average them and they go right back to the center, right? Like, so it's this fascinating thing of, right, like, how do you prevent partial data points being used, and also how do you fuzz individual data points correctly?
It feels like there is quite the tension in between. We want a lot of data.
There's quite the tension, and also, like, at least for Honeycomb, we just say, don't send us that data. Like, please don't send us that data. And, if you do accidentally send it, like, let us know. We'll redact it from our records.
But it feels like even wider than just the personable the PII. There is the tension in between. I'm working for a business and we want to know everything because that allows us to better serve our customers. And on the other hand, oh crap, now I have a lot of data and I might know too much, even though knowing that allows me to improve my product, etc., etc. It feels like the balance there is really hard to figure out, and I suspect a lot of people are not thinking about it enough.
A lot of people at Google are thinking about it really hard, and they weren't always. It started a few years ago, but they sure are now. And I agree, there's this huge spectrum
Right, like the larger the amount of data you store, the more tempting it becomes as a single target, but also the more resourced you are to defend it, right? Like people talk about this risk in terms of, people have talked about this risk in terms of social media, right? Like, and, saying, hey, I don't trust that really big company to run it. I'd rather host my own. I'm like, do you know how many individual, VMs get breached every single year, right? Like you don't hear about it because it's just an individual VM being breached or ransomed, but like, your data is probably actually more safe with a large company than it is, hosting it yourself.
Very much so. I mean, Google has security teams and site reliability engineers and people who protect data centers and physical security around their data centers, and so many things that I as an individual could never have.
Yeah, and they like very big companies have paid people to think about that, right? And that's what I meant when I said I suspect a lot of people don't think about it, is that a lot of companies are not Google or are not Google size, and so can't afford to have people thinking about that, right?
Yeah, and I think that is one of the arguments for not doing it yourself, right? Like, yes, you can run a Grafana LGHM stack yourself. Yes, you can run a ClickHouse stack yourself, but also ClickHouse Cloud is right there. Honeycomb is right there, right? Like we are specialists specifically in preserving and maintaining and running observability data stores, right? Like, so I think the argument is focus on what you can uniquely differentiate on, and don't do this kind of undifferentiated heavy lifting that you might not do as good of a job at as someone who's dedicated to doing that. I think one other point about privacy and security that I might raise, though, is yes, data does degrade in usefulness as it gets older, but also sometimes you really do need that raw and aggregated data, right? Like think about security access logs, right? Like if you discover a breach after a month, right? If you've aggregated away all the information about where the attacker was a month ago, right? Like you are going to be hopelessly lost, right? So I do think that there are situations where you might need to look at the full fidelity data, and also that is on an exception basis rather than on a regular basis.
But again, that puts you into the quote-unquote crosshairs of now you have the data. Even if you're not looking at it, you do have the data, right?
Yep. So that's the kind of argument of access logs for internal employee stuff are much lower risk than access logs than records of what your customers are doing. And
law enforcement is far less likely to ask for that kind of thing. They are much more likely to ask about things that users did.
Yes, unless you are reporting, a breach from North Korea to the FBI or whatever. In that case, they may want to go through it, although you're probably handing it to them voluntarily anyway.
Probably you are, if that should happen to happen.
I'm gonna switch topics quite widely, and then don't hesitate to bring it back to this topic if you want. But should every company, no matter the size, be thinking about observability from day one? Or is there a point where they should switch on the thinking about observability?
My goal is that observability becomes so ubiquitous and baked in by default that you don't have to be a specialist in it, right? I think that people should set expectations of good observability for sure. But I think a lot of that implementation no longer needs to be a specialist role or specialist knowledge, right? Like, and I think, for instance, OpenTelemetry helps with that, right? Like, because every agent knows how to instrument a code base in any language with OpenTelemetry, right? You can just say, add tracing to this, and it will do it, and it will do a competent job at it, and will do it better than, someone who is not an expert in it, right? Sure, I as an expert might be able to do a better job, but like, right, like I think that kind of level of, at least on the instrumentation side, right, of adding things to your code to add observability, I think that should be something that the agents solve for us and that we don't have to think about. But then you can record all the data in the world, but if you're not sending it to a useful data store, right, like if you're not actually able to get good results, right, like then you have a problem. I think, we need to demand better of our systems and to create pressure for, us to select solutions that work better for us.
Isn't there also the point of, now I have all that data and it's in the correct place and it has the correct form, but I don't have time to look at it or to actually analyze it? And so what's the point of actually collecting it, right?
Again, why isn't an agent looking at that data for you, right? Why isn't it pulling out anomalies, right? Why aren't you setting service level objectives? And when your service level objective is in danger, automatically doing that outlier analysis to figure out which users are most impacted or correlated, right? Like, sure, maybe the user isn't causing it, but they're worst affected, right? Like, and that impacts where you might go to resolve it, right? Like maybe it's correlated to a build ID, in which case you roll back the build ID, right? Like, so I think making the data structured and available, and then also having the capability to either yourself with your own eyeballs and or with an agent look at it, right? Like I think that's how you make that automated and not conditional upon, did you have the right expert who understands how to work your Splunk instance?
We've brushed a couple of times the AI subject, and I thought this was going to be the episode where we didn't talk about AI, but unavoidable. How does that changes things? How does the current LLM craze change things?
It's a validation crisis, right? Like it's cheap to generate code. It's very expensive to understand and analyze it and debug it. And I think that's why observability is more important now than ever. And also, it's easier to do.
It's easier to do in the sense that the LLM can assist you in providing the analysis, or the LLM will do the analysis for you?
Both. The LLM can generate the telemetry data, right? Like by instrumenting your code. It can perform analyses of the data, and then it can surface to you what it found interesting so that you can decide what to do about it. I don't believe in full closed loop, hey, the LLM inspects it and ships it and, analyzes it itself. I think that there is a valuable human judgment role to play.
I will also say that the LLM development is becoming a little bit more of a security crisis as well, right? AIs are getting better and better at breaching security walls, at accessing data that you would rather have hidden.
That is the tension, right? Like, these newer models are, being made to be more agentic, aka doing shit on their own. And yes, being able to understand what they did and why, that is also its own form of meta observability of, right? Like, so there are these two things, right? Like using AI to assist in your observability and also having observability into what these chaos agents are doing, right? Like those are two separate and somewhat intertwined problems.
I think this is a nice jumping off point of, and it's something I read from your boss, Liz. Basically, everyone is testing in production, and having good observability is just assuming that you're testing in production, right? Or something along those lines.
Everyone tests in production whether they admit it or not.
It's not testing in production, it's iterating in production. It is being curious about how your product is being perceived in production and being humble enough and reasonable enough to act on that. If you have no curiosity about your product in production, if you are not interested in acting on that knowledge, then don't log at all. You're acting based on some other force. But I would highly encourage people to be both curious and humble, because the world is surprising. And there's always more questions to ask that you did not see coming.
Yes, but if you allow me a little but, it feels like observability might have a lot of noise to signal ratio compared to running users interview, which also has this humility and this curiosity attached to it, right?
Yeah, I think that is true. I think that they are both forms of gathering data. I think that the telemetry data can't tell you why a user did it or what they're thinking, but it can absolutely tell you at scale what users did. And I think, and that's not data that you can collect on, thousands of users, right? You can only bring in so many users for user interviews, right? Like, so I think it's this combination of being able to look at the forest and yes, occasionally look at and sample individual trees too, but like that kind of whole forest view, I think is what's important about kind of the broader observability, and then being able to hone in on all of the evergreens or hone in on, all of the trees who have yellow leaves, right? Like that kind of analysis without having to go and interview individual users is a trait of good observability if you can run those queries to kind of get granular analysis.
Yep, I agree completely.
I think we're getting close to the 1 hour mark. There is a question with which or a typology of questions that I'd like to end these episodes with, and it's, what would you recommend to someone that is starting out in this observability world or doesn't know anything yet but is curious and interested about it? Where should they start?
Follow the user flow, identify what is the user trying to do, right? What's the outcome they're trying to achieve? And then follow that path. Make sure that it's instrumented, make sure that you can follow along and see whether the user is succeeding at it and whether or not they kind of fall out of the happy path funnel.
And also log what you are curious about. Log what you don't know. If you're not sure whether users go from page A to page B, log it so you can take a look.
Yeah, write down your questions, right? Figure out, what would I need to answer these questions, and also what would I need to answer future questions I didn't think of. But if you're constrained only to being able to ask the questions that, someone has already decided for you that those are the questions you're going to ask, right? Like you're going to be really, really constrained and hemmed in.
Words to live by, not just in software.
Indeed. And I think with that, we can bring the episode to a close. it's certainly gonna change how I both log and consume the data of the logs. So thank you so much about this conversation. It was really, really interesting. Thank you both for agreeing to be here.
Thank you, Pablo.